Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Grolier for another evening of poetry. We're thrilled to have you all here to welcome Dan Tobin and Elizabeth T. Gray, two astounding poets. If you're familiar with their work, you know what a great night you're in for. And if you're not familiar with their work, then I won't spoil the surprise. I ask that you silence your phones if you have not already, so as not to disturb the presentation. And we hope that you enjoy the poetry. And with that, let's give Dan Tobin and Elizabeth T. Gray a warm round of applause. Hey. Dan Tobin.
We're just making our way in.
Am I on video?
Will be.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is a place that has mattered to me for more than 50 years. It's such an amazing time to be here. This is my friend Dan Tobin. Let me tell you a bit about him.
I'm sorry, could you speak up a little bit?
Yep. Oh, I thought this, so this is not a microphone. This is just recording.
Correct.
Okay. Dan is the author of 9 books of poems. Between 1999 and 2014, there were a number of them. Since then, he's published The Net with 4-way books, From Nothing, Blood Labors, which was a New York Times and Washington Independent Review of Books, Best Poetry Book of the Year, one of them. And he's translated Salient. He's the author of a number of critical studies, including Passage to the Center, Imagination and the Sacred in the works of Seamus Heaney, and On Serious Earth from Horizon Books. He's received the Robert Penn Warren Award, the Robert Frost Fellowship, the Catherine Bacallus Nason Prize, the Stephen Marengoff Award, and fellowships from the NEA, the Guggenheim Foundation. He teaches at Emerson, and he's got a new and selected poems about to come out called Dusk Empire, and a chapbook just out, From the Distances of Sleep.
And let me say a few words about Elizabeth Gray Jr.
Liz.
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 Liz. She's going by Liz.
Dropping all the
all the formalities are dropping
all
now.
the
We're
stuff
even
exists.
sitting down.
right.
Is a poet, translator, critic, and corporate consultant. Poetry collections include After the Operation, 4-way books 2025, Salient, New Directions 2020, and Series India, 4-way books 2015. Her translations from classical and contemporary Persian include Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season, poems of Forough Farrokhzad, New Directions 2022, finalist for the Penn Prize for Poetry and Translation, and The Green Sea of Heaven, 80 Hustles from Diwan of Hafiz, 30th anniversary edition. She serves on the boards of Kimbilio Fiction, World Poetry, Flood Editions, Friends of Writers, the Beloit Poetry Journal Foundation, and Human Rights and Democracy in Iran. She holds a BA and JD from Harvard University and an MFA from Warren Wilson College. She was founding CEO, managing partner of Conflict Management Incorporated and Alliance Management Partners, boutique corporate consulting firms. Liz Gray.
So Dan and I met at Warren Wilson. We've known each other for a long time, and we share an appetite for books of poetry that go after, not only that go after and reach for big questions, but also involve lots of research, not all of them, but some of them. And tonight we wanted to get together and talk about two of our book-length collections. We wanted to talk some about composing, where your unit of composition is the book as opposed to the poem or the sequence. And both of the books that we're going to read from and talk about involve massive amounts of historical research. Dan's, The Mansions, is structured like the Divine Comedy in cantos and canticles, and it's 100 poems long, and it deals with three figures who bridge science and a quest for or experience of the divine. So there's Georges Lemaitre, who was a Belgian Jesuit, Belgian Jesuit priest, who was also a cosmologist and quantum physicist. Dan can talk more about him. Second one is Simone Weil, who was a political mystic and political person. And the last one is Teilhard de Chardin, who was a paleontologist, an archaeologist, and a theologian. So the book explores these questions through those three lives. The book I'm going to read from arose from combining two obsessions of mine that arose in high school. I have two friends from my high school class here. Down in the stacks, I got obsessed with this battle that the British fought in Belgium in 1917. I cannot explain to you why. That's an obsession. And some Tibetan texts of protective magic that I also came across at the time. And over the ensuing 30 years, I kept collecting books on these topics and kept reading them without any idea why. The book arose from juxtaposing those two threads of textual traditions. And what arose out of that was a quest for the 100,000 British soldiers that vanished into the mud of the Ypres salient, and their bodies were never found. So they are the missing. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to, each of us read from these books, and then we're going to ask each other some questions. And then we're going to, and feel free to interrupt and ask questions. Then we're going to go back and read a little more. And at the end, we can have a more open conversation. So that's the game plan. I've picked ones because of Dan and I talking about how you make lyric poetry from some of the driest history. I've picked some poems that are gonna perhaps, I hope, show you how those two texts come together and blend. So there are Tibetan texts that are stolen from, there are British field manuals that are stolen from, and some of it is the voice of the speaker. Looking for the war. Crest Farm was never called that on German maps, was not actually a farm, was captured at great cost by 72nd Battalion, 4th Canadian Division, the Seaforth Highlanders, Vancouver, on 30th October 1917. It was the jumping off line for the 27th Battalion of the 2nd Canadian Division from the city of Winnipeg at 0600 on 6th November, but is not here. No signs of it or what happened. Just a small car park, pub, this circle of maples, a bakery, this line of tidy houses down a road. In some ways, the situation is analogous to that facing Second Army in 1915. The trig and mapping situation is complex. Here I am straddling the Franco-Belgian frontier, and several sets of trig data of varying antiquity exist for the region. The trigonometric problem is that although others have begun to use the Belgian spheroid, origin, azimuth, and sheet lines as the basis for their own survey, referring the French data to these, the absence of central geodetic control at some general headquarters leaves each of us to our own devices. My situation is difficult. I have to reconcile the trig and leveling data of the various systems available for the area, including the French Admiralty triangulation and British cross-channel work, with my own emotions, complex mathematical calculations, and a feeling of loss. I was obsessed with maps and trench maps. So there are some coordinates in here which refer to the British survey, the Royal Survey Corps mapping system. Harm, and the location of this poem is just north of Railway Wood, trench map sheet 28, Northwest 4, Ypres. Ypres was the salient that they were all fighting in. We are no longer confused about harm. Harm is in specific locations. I-5D91, for example, the small field 100 yards due east of Gully Farm. We strive to remain unattached, without attraction or aversion to material forms. The way Phillips and Mercer did, who understood such distinctions. Most of them is still missing. Notes on the interpretation of aerial photographs. Concentrate your whole mind on the particular objects you are seeking. Do not let your attention wander to subsidiary objectives. Follow every traverse and detail with your pointer in regular and logical order. The signs of wind dissolving into space are a darkening of some areas and black splotches on the external body. The inner signs are a bright radiance, like the light in a cloudless sky. Ascertain the direction of light. Shadow plays a most important part in trying to decide whether the circular shape you see is convex or concave. At just such a point, all the great fears come. The guts of it. This is drawn from the diary of a medic, a Canadian medic. He overheard this. The guts of it. I think I would prefer to be killed in a railway accident, he said. Why? Well, because, well, there you are. But if you're killed by an exploding shell, he went on, then where the hell are you?
Okay, the conversation will begin with me reading a few sections from Nothing. And these are about Georges Lemaitre. And I'll read a couple of these or so, and then we'll start having the conversation. This is the first poem in the sequence. It's called Fountain. To figure from nothing, holiness in perihelion, the one must not proclaim it, but let the matter spin along its poles into the bright entanglements, like two particles of light flung to opposite zones, and still the one moves with and how the other moves, love's choreography in the elegance of the dance. Though maybe it's more like matter and antimatter, the one canceling the other in a blinding negation, number and Newman locked in their separate estates. You would not collapse them to a point's white heat, but kept them before you, your physics and your faith, the divergent roads with their singular horizon, where the radius of space converges into zero, where what was, is, will be, waxes without boundary into seed and sand grain, a cepheid luster of eyes. News of the minor signature keyed from everywhere, the primal radiation omnipresent, the prodigal wave arriving from its now that has no yesterday. The proof of your calculus, the tour of the expanse. The evolution of the universe might be compared to a display of fireworks that has just ended, some few red wisps, ashes, and smoke. So we stand on a well-cooled cinder to see the fading of suns, to glimpse a vanished brilliance, the origin of worlds. This is called Observance, and as you heard in Liz's few poems, she has different voices enter, that Medic, the most obvious one. This is in the voice of Edwin Hubble, the great astronomer, hence the Hubble telescope, where we get pictures. Observance. Tall, strong, beautiful, with the shoulders of Hermes of Praxiteles, that is how my wife first fashioned me. I, who proved our Milky Way but another galaxy among the Nebelflecken, fleeing breakneck with the rest by the law of the constant, the time that bared my name, Hubble, stamped with Newton, Copernicus, Galileo. Not bad for an Ozark boy, farm boy, hotted off to Oxford on a Rhodes, who tailored himself to tweeds and speaks the king's English as though he'd suckled on shires. Astronomy, I attest, is a history of receding horizons, though mine tend to open to dinners with Stravinsky, the Fairbanks, and coup de maître, my surprise star turn at the Oscars, spotlights, applause, the whole heavens blue shifted to me. Still, nothing headier than nights on Mount Wilson, I at the lens, my briar pipe glowing, Humason at the spectroscope tracing the light shifts, who was my mule driver. His habits, straight poker, panther juice, try the soul, but he's brilliant at the shot. Odd too, the little priest who came to visit years ago, that he should account for nebula's radial velocities 2 years before me, though I only trust the data. How he looked calmly pleased at Einstein's recantation, the most beautiful solution to creation I have ever heard. So clocks reel back with space, camera, action, light. And this is called Aperture. And so let the mind commit a thought experiment. Split the physicist from priest like a single photon shot through a screen, charting the divergent paths. Consider a civilization where music is unknown, only acoustics and frequencies, the notes like an air unbreathable for the animal in its element. Is this not where our method leads us? Into matter as matter, force as force, the amplitudes of blank smoke unnecessary, number as number, and nothing more. Infinity is such an artistic creation, all symmetry and elegance, but your method smacks of metaphysics, lifeless life, and the Bible is not a textbook of science. If relativity theory had been necessary to salvation, it would have been revealed to St. Paul or Moses. Still, the deeper we penetrate the universal mystery, the more we find one law and one goodness. Newton's Principia, Abbe Mendel and his P's, from quantum to quanta, all purposeless process. Time's arrow at T0 has a barb at each end that makes the infinite universe a buried corpse. Our world is now a world where something happens, with the world's matter present from the beginning, with the world's story to be written step by step. In Venom, Crematoria, the animal's voided blood. And I'll read one more and then stop. And this is called Imago. Lemaitre was a very serious physicist, so he conceptualized the Big Bang and was called the Big Bang Man, jokingly. But he was also a very serious student of spirituality. Imago. But to discern God's will in this will-o'-the-wisp world, the seeming random daubs conjuring a picture whole, ice melting, magnetism from dead metal, and time itself a shatter of moments, phase shifted from the everlasting into these vectors of growth and decay. Flatlanders aware, unaware, endowed with a prized biological contraption, whereby they know nature does not act by purposes, that nature in itself has no reverence for life. And in your notebooks, with the neat calculations, graphs, your parsing of uncertainty, elliptical space, those passages translated from Royce Brooks' Tabernacle, this light eternal, engulfing all, a mysterious heat. Shall we call it God's non-locality, everywhere at once, that the eye altering the measure of light, this chamber eye misses, calibrated as it is for the predator and prey? Human being is an animal, you wrote, and human being is a child of God. While in the animal world, the transports gain frequency, annihilated cargo in this Goldilocks world with all the dials set for our arrival. Luck like grace and love like gravitation, a force, so the saint dreamed, attracting the scattered sparks, jumbled puzzle to itself. So in your house with friends, you gather again to pray. Transcendence isn't passage, it's adding one life to another. Light drawn to light in the image of every victim's face.
Well, I have a question. So as I understand it, you started with Lemaitre,
I
that
did,
he was your first guy.
yes.
And now in the book, we have Simone Weil and we have Teilhard de Chardin. How long was the list? Because poetry is about arrangement, but it's about selection. So I want to know how you encountered the other two and who didn't make the cut,
Okay, I can do
and
that.
what was the theme?
Well, it started off, the whole project started off as one book, not 3 book-length poems. So now it's 3 book-length poems that are linked together in one design. And my wife and I were watching a PBS series about, I'm interested in science and interested about the beginnings of things. And lo and behold, the guy who was talking about the early 20th century physics brought up Georges Lemaitre, who I didn't know about, and I realized was a Jesuit priest, and he was the Big Bang guy. He's the guy who actually saw that the universe began, so we still believe so far, in a singularity that explodes. And he wrote a book called The Primeval Atom, as opposed to the Primeval Quantum. So that's where it started off. And as soon as I got on that, I was sold. So it took a few years to do the Lemaitre, and it involved archival material, traveling to Belgium, reading a lot of his work, reading other work, and bringing that to bear. But then,
Because he had the amazing physics and the religious background.
absolutely,
Right.
he says, I have
The divine is something that has interested you.
it's a part of my upbringing and who I am, and it's being concerned with ultimate things, right?
Right.
Physics is concerned also with
Yeah.
ultimate things.
The
It's
nature
just
of
reality. So that very interesting intersectional mashup, which is not really a mashup at all, for Lemaitre. And Lemaitre was somebody who said, there are 2 paths to truth. I have chosen both, was his response, which I just love that. So how did I get then to Simone Weil and Teilhard de Chardin? Teilhard de Chardin was in the mix early on. I didn't know it was going to become a part of this, but I always been compelled by Teilhard de Chardin because, similarly, very much a scientist, very much a theological thinker, and also somebody who was silenced by the church for his whole life. His actual writings were not allowed forth until after 1955, which is the year he died. And then it became very prominent for a while. It's not as prominent nowadays. And then I had to really think through who the next was going to be. And the other one who was in the mix, there was always as soon as Lemaitre hit, he was in, and then Teilhard came in just logically. They overlap in a lot of their experiences, both fighting in World War I and so forth. I was actually inclined to Dorothy Day, the great Catholic communist who started the Catholic worker movement, but it didn't set right for me. You have these two French guys, and then suddenly you're going into the Lower East Side, Manhattan. How do you get there? It doesn't make any sense, right? But then I've always been interested in Simone Weil, a very complicated figure. And I thought, yeah, that makes sense because Teilhard is very much an optimist. I'm not sure I share the optimism as much, but he's very much an optimist. And Weil was, there's more truth in the past than there is in the future. So the Weil section goes from just after her death to before her birth. So it works backwards in time. So that handling of time had something with the choice of Weil, among the fact that I was always interested in her. A difficult person. I like that too. Yeah. So, but I have a question for you.
I'm shocked. This was actually pre-programmed a little.
Yeah, I mean, you have these two sources that have been compelling to you from very early age, high school. That's pretty early. So I'm interested in how you got to the point of bringing these two sources together and the ability that you have in this poem to transform what could be mere information, right? Oh, here's something about the war, here's something about Tibetan Buddhism, into poetry that is actually working to bring those two things together in a compelling and evocative and overall architectural way.
Well, as I said, I never made any connection between these two obsessions. I was somehow interested in this battle, which it turns out, the British cast as a great victory, but of course was just the poster child for pointless slaughter. And I was very into the Tibetan Book of the Dead at the time. It was 1967. That's like what we were doing. It was the hippie time. And as I was exploring the Tibetan Buddhism, death, wrathful deities, wasn't the cheeriest childhood I had. I stumbled across these texts that were about a very fringy Tibetan ritual where it's an exercise in severing your attachment to your physical body and exhibiting the utmost compassion. And you go out to a scary place like a cremation ground or a desert or a mountain pass, and you visualize taking your body off, laying it out like a picnic basket, taking your skull in half and dismembering yourself and cooking yourself in the skull and summoning all the gods and demons that you fear, like just all the bad guys, and you feed them this red banquet. Anyway, as a testament to how obsessed I was with these two really separate things, I did grow up next to a graveyard, so some of that is explicable. For the next 30, 40 years, I collected books on these two topics. And as people started to translate Tibetan Buddhism, what was one fringy text, badly translated, I understand now, became a bookshelf. And I found all these, World War I obsessed booksellers and people, and collected all of that and trench maps and everything else. But I was mostly interested in going to India and seeking enlightenment. So I've always been interested in mysticism and what is the nature of actual reality. So I was obsessed with Tantric Buddhism and Hinduism. Through translation, I did some Sufism, not as a practitioner, to be clear. Anyway, my first poetry book is called Series India, and it's about a journey to the East. Once I had that done, I thought, well, what am I going to do now? And I thought, well, I have these two obsessions. What if I put them together, right? And see what happens in the force field between them. And at the time, I was reading people like Rosemary Waldrop and people who were experimenting with literary collage. So I thought, well, what the heck?
There you go.
Well, it turns out that the Tibetan stuff were manuals. They were instruction manuals. And the British stuff were also instruction manuals. One was on how to dig a trench and how to make sure the front of your trench could withstand a certain kind of artillery shell. And the others were instruction manuals on how to figure out where the demons are in the ground and keep yourself safe from them. It didn't occur to me at the time, those were similar practices, but the tonal consistency, they're both instruction manuals. So you can take the text and put them together without a change in tone. And I realized that as I started to do that, that it really was a quest for the missing. Where had those British soldiers gone? So I literally, between 2012 and 2018, spent 4 to 6 weeks, spring and fall, wandering this one battlefield in Belgium with trench maps and meeting all the other nutty pilgrims who were all over that. And as I put them together, they seemed to work. And it came with some of my own questing language. But I was as shocked as everybody else to say, oh my God, this is actually working. And I didn't understand what the overlap was. You know, it was like, these are dismembered soldiers who have vanished into the ground. And I thought if I had the right map or had the right spell, I could reclaim them and they would be safe. That, of course, didn't work. But what I realized later, just before it all came together, was, yeah, but while the poem is ongoing, they are there and present in some moment of lyric space-time, and they're safe for the duration of that poem. Was that responsive?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so, absolutely.
You know, I get off on a track. And I'm like, wow, is that the question?
That's the question. That's the question. Are we gonna have people pop in?
You got a question or two? But then we'll go back to reading a little.
Yeah, I'm curious to know what you mean by the long poem. It seems to me like you're both writing or reading from poems that are thematically, they're individual poems that are thematically linked, as opposed to, say, In Memoriam,
Right.
which is, you know, broken up by stanzas, but it's one continuous poem, or Thomas McGrath's great Letter to an Imaginary Friend, which is broken up into books, but it's really a continued lyrical narrative. And I'm just wondering what would be your definition of the long poem?
Well, I'm happy to field that. That's a question that I mean, I was inspired by the cantos. And, you know, Rachel Blau du Plessis, I don't know if you've seen her new book called A Long Essay on the Long Poem, but the borders between all these are very fuzzy. And at the end of this one, I decided to call it a poem and had long conversations with New Directions about that. Because if you pull the things apart that look like a single poem on the page, they don't have the same resonance. It was impossible for me to send these to journals because they didn't work. And I think that for me, the long poem has to do with a recursivity and a resonance or consonance that has to go together, right? And there were poems, these are culled from about 230 draft poems. There were some that I loved passionately, didn't fit, doesn't work. And so I've had a million arguments with people about what it is. And I think everybody's clear that In Memoriam is at one end, you know, and, you know, E.E. Cummings or somebody's at the other. But it's an excellent question. So I'll let Dan answer.
Yeah, well, I would kind of more or less reiterate what Liz just said. I mean, you can take a canto out of the Divine Comedy and it can function as a poem. Ugolino is, I believe, the last poem in Seamus Heaney's Fieldwork, which is his translation of a section of Dante's Inferno. And it works as an individual poem, but technically it's not really an individual poem, right? You can take out one of those cantos and read it individually the way you could see a portion of a mural and say, oh, that makes sense, coherence totally on its own there. But it has the full force of connectivity in the design of the whole. So in the case of the mansions, 33 cantos, 24 lines each, all the same pattern, all the same, forms from nothing. 33 cantos, 24 lines each. That's also, Simone Weil, This Broken Symmetry. And then finally, At the Grave of Théo de Chardin is also 33 cantos, 24 lines each, all the same. So it's very much ordered in that particular way. And then the 100th canto is threaded through across each one, which is in a double helix motion organization, also 24 lines.
So, an analogy on that, as I sit here and look around, one would be, Shakespeare's sonnets are gorgeous individual sonnets, but there's also the arc of the youth and the lady. And Boroumand's sonnets are even more so, right? I mean, that's really a narrative of his affair in the woods.
So is the dreams.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
exactly. So, I think people can argue about that. It's a little like, I went to law school. The justices that said, well, I can't define obscenity, but I know it when I see it. So
Edgar Allan Poe, I believe, somewhere said that there is actually no such thing as the long poem, in the sense that it has to have lyric coherence in a more abbreviated state for it to be carried through.
because it's not epic, right? We're not talking about
Not
epic or
epic.
narrative or quest poem or whatever. If it's a lyric, but there's this question of how far can you attenuate a lyric? Because there's an intensity at the level of the poem and the line that's not sustainable the way it would be in the Iliad or something.
You read some passages from like Edwin Hubble that seemed to be, I don't know if you said it was from his journals or they're quoted.
Yeah.
How much did you take verbatim? How much liberty did you take? How did you decide? Do you feel any guilt about it?
No, I don't. I feel absolutely no guilt
Good,
about
good,
that at
good.
all. I did research. I read about Edwin Hubble. I didn't take anything from his journals directly, but what I did take was from his biography. So I knew, for example, that he had a star turn at the Oscars. So that becomes part of it. I think it's kind of interesting that here you have this guy who was genuinely and rightly so famous for what he's contributed to science, but in the wider culture, he had this, everything turns to Hubble. In the meantime, there's little George Lemaitre, who had the idea of the universe beginning in a big bang, who is almost totally unknown. And so I turned toward, I think that contrast was needed. And I think multiple voices, a sort of polyphonic orientation. Now, the last bit of the first thing I read was directly from George Lemaitre's writing. The last two tercets of the first poem I read, that's him talking almost exactly in his own words. I mean, I do shape it so that there's something metrically coherent going on, and there's something coherent going on in the way the lines operate. It's a little bit of a 6 beats, 7 beat per line, essentially. So I had to do something to adjust that.
And mine are lifted. I mean, just kind of stolen verbatim. And because of the tonal overlap, I tried to make the seams between them invisible so that you don't know for a minute or two that you've actually shifted. I've got a couple of those lined up. Are you going next or mine?
I can go next.
May I ask?
Yeah.
How does your war poetry differ from Wilfred Owen's or Siegfried Sassoon's? Because they were eyewitnesses.
They were eyewitnesses. I was not.
Yes.
And so, as a very astute critic friend of mine said, right, this is a book about epistemology. How do we know? It's not, and it's not about how it was. It's not about me pretending I was a soldier. It was reviewed. There was a really interesting review to me. I mean, those are the best ones where the poet figures out stuff they didn't know about their work. That was written by a guy who had served for 14 years in the British Parachute Special Forces, the SAS. And he had turned into a novelist. And he wrote a review in the International Journal of Veterans Affairs. Trust me, New Directions had not thought about that market. And, you know, he said, she's a civilian, but she's not trying to talk about how it is. Owen and Sassoon, they had that credibility. And if I ever went anywhere near that, I have no credibility. So it's not clear to me who the speaker is in here. Clearly there's a woman wandering around the battlefields 100 years later. But the question, and it took a long time for me to figure out what was going on in this book. I have a writing group and they kept saying, do you have any emotional stake in this poem?
Have you been influenced by these two poets, for instance?
Oh, well, I've been riveted by this part of the war since I was a teenager. So I have read the complete works of every single poet that wrote in English and a lot of the others in translation. And, you know, Owen just slays me. I mean, he's amazing. And some of Sassoon, late Wilfred Owen, some of Sassoon, Ivor Gurney. Anyway, so that I couldn't possibly tread on that ground. But those guys, coupled with, you know, oh God, you know, reading accounts of the time and diaries and histories but I had to be really careful. Sorry,
That's okay.
I interrupted.
No.
Can I ask a question? So when we're talking about this one poem just a minute ago, I just wondered if both of you could speak a little bit to, and the lyric nature of the work both of you were doing. If you could speak just for a moment to how elements of polyphony and varying perspectives, how important that was to creating these texts.
Great question. Do you want to go or do you want me to go first?
You can go first. I'm also wondering if we might, if with that question hanging in the air about
Maybe you should
polyphony and
read-
sound, read a little
go-
more and then come back to that.
That's great.
Because I think, you know, it's like if you're putting together a British artillery field manual, where's the music in that?
Go for it.
I'm going to change what I'm going to read on the basis of that question. So I had a little bit of Edwin Hubble. I'm going to read two sections from This Broken Symmetry. Simone Weil, very complex individual. This is in the voice of French philosopher Gustave Tobin, who was a friend of Simone Weil. So again, vectors of perception. And then I'll read one more, and then I'll read a couple from Teilhard. Are we going to do it that way? Sure. Yeah. Okay, so this is in Gustave Tobin's voice. Like someone who has spent long hours among the vines, prematurely old, bent, that's how she looked to me that day we met in Avignon, who hadn't picked yet a single cluster, her face wan, faded like a fresco angel in the Palais des Papes. Only her eyes magnificent, only her eyes alone triumph in that shipwreck of beauty, with their look of something foreign to this world. She refused our room in San Marcel, chose the ruin, earthen floored beside the wood, its scatter of rat merd, its pine needle mattress and peasant's hearth, that one small window from which she'd view the Rhone, her fairy tale house, she'd say, rest, fresh fruit, delicious air, the fear she felt of losing herself among the sensual pleasures. One time I found her sitting still on the tree trunk in front, lost in contemplation, and sensed just then a correspondence, the beauty of that soul and the landscape's tender majesty. But how raw her friend suffered her will for immolation, she who chided me for withholding my true measure of stripping myself away. For her, the beauty of the world was the mouth of a labyrinth. In the center, there God waits to eat the soul. So, in San Julien, she joined with harvesters, disappearing among the rows of pendant grapes, embodied wine, cutting free the perfectly nurtured, bruise-colored fruit, hour by hour, for days. Her sandaled feet bleeding, purifying her, she'd say, until I see the landscape as it is when I am not there. And I'll just read two more, and these are going to be from the last one. Since we're on the subject of polyphony, this is called A Moon on the Front, and I wanted to read it because it's very much in resonance with the Salient by Liz. And the speaker of this poem is the moon itself. In other words, different perspectives. The first half of At the Grave of Teilhard de Chardin is all from the perspective of inanimate objects, or apparently inanimate objects, as they start talking.
Yeah, they're very chatty.
They're very chatty, inanimate objects. A moon on the front. So you have to imagine, Teilhard also fought in Salient. At night when I wake, I am a blind man's cyclopic eye, safe in my sky perch above the barbed wire, the trenches, rising here beyond this swarming maelstrom, this maul, this species' bloody call, the slough of its scored becoming. I who tore myself free of the earth, its molten offspring tempered to shining dust and the poet's petulant dreams. This one, this scientist, this priest, asleep in his shell hole, carries with him through the hell below a double of me, the lifeless host he knows to be the spirit's flesh and furnace. Brancardier, stretcher bearer, some call him seedy marabout, straight-backed as a steel, with the face of an El Greco, shielded, the sharpshooters say, by the baraka as he climbs over ridge and parapet, lifting the broken, the butchered, non-believer. If he dies, he will just be changed, all a part of the human magnitude, the psychic current of the universe, for eternal being itself is everywhere in process of formation for us. Ypres, Dunkirk, Verdun, if he's killed, he said, mold his body to the redoubt's clay like mortar laid by God for the stones of the new city. Soon, along the splayed and cratered tree line, the unforged light assumes again its precedence, while he imagines I am a figure for the planet's slow awareness growing, passed hand to hand, mind on march, and the world the battlefield with seasons, rivers, meadows, the perfume of dead leaves. I think I'll just leave those two.
That was amazing. So I'll read one where the distinction between the military field manual and the Tibetan is noticeable. And then I'll end with one that is also sonic, where that is mostly drawn from Tibetan. In the soft parts of the body. In the soft parts of the body, wounds from large fragments or entire projectiles show extensive and deep contusions, crushing, a tearing away of tissue. They are vast erosions, deep furrows, large lesions, often with significant pieces of flesh hanging, fimbriated, ecchymiotic, contused, and frequently in their deep parts, complicated by metallic foreign bodies, by earth, by fragments of clothing, and are thus doomed to suppuration and grave complications, gangrene and tetanus, for example. For such wounds, use a simple dadar, fletched with crow, with a slender point of polished copper, and its shaft painted red. To its feathered end, attach 5 narrow lengths of silk, yellow, white, red, blue, and green, and 3 sheep bone dice. Move a mirror along the patient's body until it reaches the source of his pain. At this exact location, set the arrow with its point touching the wound and begin to suck on the other end of the shaft. In this way, clots of blood, free splinters of shrapnel, and all tissue that has lost its vitality are removed. Wipe the wound surface with a pad soaked in permanganate of potassium, and then apply an ointment containing corrosive sublimate, salol, antipyrine, carbolic acid, and idioform with Vaseline as an excipient. Further instructions. This is on the eve of the Passchendaele battle. 15th, 5 November 1917, 11:45 p.m. Trench map sheet 28 Northeast 1 Zonnebeke. After the power suppression ceremony has been completed by the artillery, and you have reached the center of the village at D6, D45, and have consolidated in that terrifying place, summon as your guests all who seek to harm you, all who damage thoughts, all who set obstacles before you, all that you don't know, all that you see incorrectly, all that haunts that specific location. All of these and all sentient beings of the three realms have been your parents. Cherish them. The missing. Some became smoke, cloud, and rain. As when a pot breaks and the space within and the space without become intermingled, the body reduced to its atomic constituents indistinguishable from the awareness within. Others dissolved in light, into light from their feet upwards. The heavy shelling at D6, D45, west of what remained of the church, for example. And after the light faded from the sky, there were no bodies. So it is said that instead of wooden crosses, they have names planted in space. I'll finish with this. Our bodies. Our bodies grew younger, pliant, light, like the 10 winds or cotton wool, changeless and radiantly luminous. We will be separated for just a moment. When I look over my shoulder, a dense mist where there had been coral and turquoise. Your words were lies to me, but not to you, a promise incompletely informed, as we are when we make a vow in earnest or the moment, all alloy of desire and blindness, suspended, all wish embedded in the apotropaic, the way the figure waits in clay, cooling slowly, assuming he will be released back to daylight, intact, by clearing parties or skilled craftsmen. My body may have felt like a lie to you, but not to me. Although there were lights in the dark air, falling slowly, illuminating the ground below where everything had stopped moving. When I looked over my shoulder, the dense mist separated for just a moment, and there were our bodies, changeless and radiantly luminous. Your words begin to sound younger, pliant, light, like the 10 winds moving into the present. When I look over your shoulder, I see the ground as an alloy of fire and blindness, that we are separated for just a moment, and a dense mist in which we are again coral and turquoise. I'll stop there.
Pick up the polyphony question.
Any question?
Want me to re-ask it?
All right, go a quick re-ask.
But since you both are working with this polyphony and these perspectives, I guess the question is, how did that help orchestrate your books? In other words, how
does the lyric
and how does the
impulse
lyric impulse, how is that
structure and use the historical
utilizing
material?
polyphony and
And the
perspective,
polyphony, different
Yeah.
voices. You want to go? You want me to
No,
go?
I want you to go.
It's absolutely essential. I knew early on that when I just was doing the Lemaitre, and I didn't realize that I was going to be doing 2 more poems that were going to be forming a single design. I knew that I couldn't just be the omniscient narrator all the way through. It would get rather boring pretty quickly, so at least for me. And I figured if I'm bored, then everybody else is going to be bored too. So I really had to think strategically about which voices were going to come in and speak. I had to think about when Lemaitre himself would speak, and he does speak. He has sections in which he talks very specifically about circumstances and so forth. Edward Hubble is one. Oppenheimer makes an appearance. There's a lot of people. It's a fairly populated first poem, offering different vectors on the one life. And it's also orchestrated in a linear fashion. Begins early, pretty much after the overture, and goes forward. Same thing with Simone Weil. I felt that I did it in the first one. I have to do something like that in the second. But Simone Weil never has her own canto.
Yeah, it's all she.
It's
It's
all she in that. That's changed. There are moments where you get bits of what she says, like in the one I read, Harvest. Gustave Thibon is speaking there. Pablo Picasso talks about Simone Weil in one of the poems. I have no evidence whatsoever that Pablo Picasso ever met Simone Weil. There's nothing to show that at all. So that was pure fictional invention on my part, but they did actually could have passed themselves in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris at any time. It's very possible that that's the case. And Gertrude Stein talks for a little while too, because they both dressed in a very masculine way. And there was a discussion about that. I mean, well, they never met. I don't know. It was just I have Gertrude Stein saying she heard about Gertrude Stein, Gertrude Stein said, I heard about Simone Weil and how she would dress like a man and all this other stuff. Although she talks like Gertrude Stein writes. So there's something going on there too. And then finally, I didn't want to do the same thing again for the Teilhard. And I said, well, what possibly thing could I do? So the whole first 11 cantos is from these inanimate objects, a wake of a ship, the moon, any number of things. His gravestone is the opening one. The gravestone's talking, right? Middle, different voices. The whole thing is different voices, not Teilhard, giving advantages on Teilhard, including his sisters, or Gabriel Marcel, Paul Valéry has a little conversation or talk. And then the last to say, what do I do now in the last thing? And I said, there's only one thing I can do, and it's got to be me the whole time. So the whole last 11 cantos is very close to the poet, essentially imagining Teilhard de Chardin as the priest on the other side of the confessional. Bless me, Father, is what you say in the confessional. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. Here's my confession. So it's not so much I did, give me 20 Hail Marys, Father. No, it's kind of a what I believe his life means, and also a little bit of an argumentation with his very positive outlook toward the future. So it's essential, in short. I wouldn't have done the poem if I had to be just some blank, omniscient third person of narrator poet the whole time.
So polyphony, for me, the multiple voice, I had no idea what this book was for 150 draft poems. I mean, I couldn't figure out what was going on or who was talking, and people kept saying, so who's the speaker? And I'm like, I don't know, we'll see. And so there's voices that come from the diaries and correspondence, right? So there are the voices of soldiers. There are the voices of generals. There's the voice of the speaker who's wandering around. We don't really know who she is, but mostly I was very interested in the disembodied voices of the instruction manuals, because no matter what they say, you have no protection against arbitrary death. There is no amulet, there's no spell, there's no slam dunk way to build a trench, there's no slam dunk way to camouflage your field gun. So I sort of stumbled around, and I don't think I could give you a theory of that, except that it was a space filled with ghosts. I mean, I had friends and family that said, you're going to Flanders for another 4 weeks. You're just going to stay in the hotel and look at your maps and read your books and wander around. Do you want company? And I'm like, oh, no, that's okay. And they're like, well, who do you talk to? And I'm like, well, there's the hotel staff. And then there's like, I don't want to talk to anybody who hasn't been dead for 100 years. So I have a friend, John Peck, he's a Jungian analyst. He said, this is kind of like the Red Book, you know, the dead are kind of talking to you.
Mhm.
And I did the last year, I met an American infantry soldier who retired infantry captain from the US Army. And he was sort of trying to pick me up at the bar at the hotel. And I was like, oh, I really don't want to be picked up by him, but I bet you that when he looks at ground, it looks different than it does to me. So I said, so here's the deal. I have some Imperial War Museum scale model trench maps. If I bring those in March when there are no leaves on the trees, will you come and I'll give you a set, but you have to walk me over the ground and show that to me. He actually was reasonably on the edge. And, you know, he actually saw soldiers. So, and he could hear them in a way that I'm not sure I could. There were some major dreams. So I can't answer your question about polyphony, but when the book, I think, does have a lot of voices in it. But what killed me was this dispassionate, all-knowing British high command tone. It's like, oh, our soldiers can certainly do this.
I just want to say, I think it's great because I think that when we're talking about the long poem, we think about a homogeneous voice. And I think that one of the things that distinguishes the work that both of you are doing is the very fact that the lyricism is emerging from the voices of manuals and those who were gone and the various people populating.
Well, and like in Dan's book, the voices are like creating a hologram, right? The voices come out of different places in space-time, but they're all focused on this sort of unstable central figure. So the voices themselves create something that you can't get at from a single point of view.
Right.
I'm assuming, since you haven't mentioned it and then read from it, you didn't do any of the poem in the voice of any of these missing soldiers. And yet, as you just alluded to, I was already sensing that in fact, this dispassionate instruction manual almost, it's like the elephant in the room, right? It's almost everything you do evokes these ghosts' voices without ever, it would be a cheap trick or something to try to.
Thank you for that. I explained it to, I didn't articulate it until somebody asked me a question like that. And it was like, I had this Tibetan text, I had these field manuals, and I knew that I couldn't use the word trench. I mean, I think the word trench appears once or twice, but there was certain stuff that I didn't have the credibility to use. I certainly couldn't take over their voices. You know, preppy American girl, I don't think so. So I thought, well, how do you create a place for what simply cannot be spoken? And there are a lot of poets who have written amazingly about the Holocaust, and it's the same dilemma, I think. So what I thought was, okay, so you have the Tibetan texts here, you have the field manuals here, and I don't have to talk about mud and trenches and masses of dead soldiers, because everybody will bring at least that much knowledge of the First World War to the table, especially now that they've seen All Quiet on the Western Front in 1917. Don't get me started on 1917. So, but between those things, you can leave stuff unspoken. And that's what I wanted to do. And that's where the missing are. But it would be,
it would ruin it.
It would ruin it. If you said, oh, you know, here I am in a trench and I'm scared of the Germans. That's like,
So it's really not just an orchestration of polyphonies, it's also those polyphonies exist in an orchestration with silence and absence, right? And so I think that that's kind of part of the polyphony.
well, and it's central to your figures.
Yeah.
Right? They're mystics. They're looking for what cannot be spoken at the intersection of paleontology and quantum physics and the confessional and God and politics and.
Yeah.
I suppose I have a question. It's about revision. So both of your books are now out in the world. Someone once said that it's all a work in progress until you're dead.
Ellen Voigt.
That's what I was just looking at, but I couldn't find it. That was her.
It's all a draft until you die is the actual direct quote. Yeah. It's Ellen Voigt. That's her. She needs credit for
It
it.
was my teacher too.
So we wish her well. And I
He's still alive.
I know, yeah. We'd love, if you're here, we'd love for you to read, Ellen, if you're listening, in the future.
We can make that happen.
But I know Bill Knott would also go into books that were published and make edits. Do you ever see down the line with the 2 books that you put out, potentially making any edits to things that are already out in the world? Or do you see it as a complete work? Yes. Sort of
Well, of course, all the doctoral students that will be flocking to our archives
Oh, yes.
will have the opportunity to do that. But, I have often thought about, there are 125 poems that didn't make it into this. Now, some of them are terrible and didn't make it to poem stage, and they were necessary to write so I could get across them and figure out what I was doing. But I occasionally think about publishing some of those, or maybe doing an expanded edition. It just doesn't work. Doesn't work. It's done. When I first put these poems together, they kind of all clicked into place, and it was very unnerving. I don't know about your arrangement, but when I got these in, and it was very hard to structure, it's not chronological. Finally, I decided it was spatial, going up the hill to Passchendaele. But I tried to take a poem out and it wouldn't come. And I tried to put some poems in that I adored, wouldn't take them. And I was like, okay, this is just too weird for words. So I walked away for a week and came back. So I think it's done.
I would say the same. I mean, it was 2009 when we saw the bit about Lemaitre on PBS, and I got very interested there. And it was 2023 when the whole thing came out. And in between that, From Nothing, the book just on Lemaitre came out. I think it was in 2016. So
Did that come out separately?
it came out separately, and then I won't go into how I got where to go whole in.
Nice.
But it was actually presented to me. I was hoping that it wouldn't be a big conversation, but it was just clicked, which is good. So I mean, I began at the beginning and I wrote till the end, although not I wrote, everything was written consecutively, and I didn't fill anything in. I knew the design. When I discovered what the design was going to be, I knew how to approach it.
Wow.
I don't imagine going in and changing anything.
Wow.
They seem like complete masterworks, but I was just wondering if that ever lingered in either of your minds.
Yeah, there were plenty of times when I was wondering, can I pull this off along the way, but you just keep plugging away at it. But, I wrote it in sequence. I did not write it in parts. I wrote From Nothing in sequence. I wrote This Broken Symmetry in sequence. And then I wrote At the Grave of Teilhard Chardin in sequence.
That's interesting. The series India book that's up there, that I wrote about 180 poems. And when I first assembled them, maybe there were 70 of them. And I could tell there were gaps, so I wrote into the gaps. And some of those are still on the cutting room floor. They might be, but this one, I had no idea what this was going to end up being. I just did drafts and kept reading and kept walking around, and I'd finish a draft and put it in a box. And every 100 or so drafts, I'd open the box and see what I had. Because, you trust your unconscious, you trust the shape of the work to tell you what you're actually doing.
Thank you both.
Is that all, folks?
Liz, I have one more question. What was it like working with New Directions?
Well, I mean, I did. Somebody sent them the manuscript. I got an email from New Directions that said, we'd really like to have your book. And I thought it was fishing.
Yeah.
Because, it's like Cinderella saying there's a coach outside or something, right? Sorry.
No, I have another question, but
Okay.
please continue.
So they said, we really want your book. I'm like, how did you get it? And they said, you didn't know we had it? And I was like, nope. And they said, well, then we probably can't tell you how we got it.
The missing strike again.
I have a sense. I think it was Nathaniel Tarn. He wrote the afterword, but he's never copped to it, and he's dead now. So that conversation's over. They were funny, they're very idiosyncratic. I got to publication date, and I was sort of like, "Are we going to do a contract for this book?" And they said, "Oh, sure." And so they did. And he said, "Don't worry, Susan Howe's book had been out for a year before we got around to that." So as a corporate consultant, I'm sort of like, have y'all considered doing a corporate reengineering procedural assessment of how you guys do business? But I wisely shut my mouth. And then they asked me, well, would you be willing to do the translations of Farrokhzad? We've been looking for 20 years for somebody to do that. And we think your translations look good. Will you do that? And I just was like, I have identical twins. If you want one, you can have it. I mean, I would be happy to do that. So they were very easy to work with. They didn't make any editorial changes to this, really, so design issues. And in the translations of Farrokhzad, I work with Jeffrey Yang, who's their poetry guy. And his questions around the Farrokhzad were wonderful in getting me to step back and take a look. But it wasn't, I mean, they're all brilliant, lovely people, but it's definitely, they have to make payroll. It's not like they have a blank check from the Laughlin Trust. I immediately went to see how they were structured and how they operated and everything I could find out about their corporate operations.
I'm sorry. I was just wondering, since you did so much research, just an absolutely capacious amount of research, I can't imagine how many notebooks that are just filled with notes about the Padishah or about World War One. What was, in the long course of your research for these books, what was the biggest surprise that emerged from your research? Maybe one that was like finding a nugget of gold, or perhaps that set you back.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Do I go?
No, I have no idea what I'm going to say. Why don't you
Okay.
go?
There were many nuggets of gold because I did immerse myself not only in scientific research. I'm not a scientist by any means, but I read pretty thoroughly in matters of science, and really, what I found, both in terms of the biographies of the figures and in the scientific, means that they're one way or another all interested in, I was able to read from metaphor, and so just tons of nuggets of gold come out of the lives if you're reading for metaphor. An incidental kind of event could be merely incidental, or it could be absolutely crucial in terms of revealing something about the figure.
And it's radioactive
And
when
it's
you're reading,
you
right?
can just tell that business, her quote, right? I look at the landscape as it is when I am not there. That was pure gold. And that's pretty much direct quote from Simone Weil. So
yeah, and that sums it all up.
yeah.
I think what felt like gold to me, if you will, was immersing myself in the manuals that these artillery and infantry people were reading at the time and getting taught by their British officers. So a degree of detail on how you set up a gun battery, and the degree of detail and math involved in how you shoot from a map when you're firing a field gun and you can't see where you're aiming. They developed during the First World War a way of doing that, and then depending on the weather, you had to alter the arc of your artillery gun. So by the time I got to the Royal Artillery Archives in Woolwich in London, I was looking at these creeping barrage maps like this, and the two guys just like, who is this woman? And they said, are you writing a history? I'm like, no, I'm a poet. And they gave me an after-hour tour of the guns. They were getting laid off that week. They'd just both been fired. And they got fired over lunch while I was there.
Nice.
And there were just 2 or 3 people in the archives. And they said, we're going to close the museum at 4. Would you like to spend an hour or 2 on all of the World War I artillery guns? We can show you how they work and move them up and down and everything else. And I'm like, isn't that illegal? And they said, what are they going to do? Fire us? So I think that level of detail and the proof in the pudding, there was a trench newspaper that was published in the Ypres Salient called the Wipers Times. You might have heard of it if you're a World War I person. It was just for the infantry and ground troops. And it was filled with, just jargon and references and slang and, that was so micro in that particular time. And I found a facsimile copy, and my husband came in and I was howling with laughter on the sofa. And he said, what's so funny? And I'm like, oh, look at this. He looks at this. Yeah. Said, oh, you don't understand. There's this culvert on the road to Hooch, about 1 kilometer out, where this thing that goes underneath it. And I went on for 15 minutes about what a joke the culvert was. So it was that level of detail, that experience. And then, there are hundreds of people like that. Like there are Confederate reenactors in America. These World War I guys, they're nuts.
In a good way.
My boys, my people.
If I may ask a question, I am very, very much in love with the Persian language, Farsi. Apart from its own stature in its diction, its impeccable imagery, etc., it also is the waterfall that feeds my own native language, which is Urdu. Urdu borrows heavily from Farsi in its ideas, etc. And so many volumes of beautiful Urdu poems exist, Yeah. So when you do these translations, do you have proficiency in the language, or do you approach it in a metaphorical sense? And how is because like the metaphor and how do I put this? Like, it's very difficult to translate those languages. As someone who is bilingual myself, when I think of, Urdu poetry and like even share with my partner some couplets and things, there's a certain sensibility that really can't be drawn out and taken into a different language because it's so sort of implicit in the culture and in the person writing it. So how do you approach the volumes of Persian poetry?
So I presume we're talking about my translations of
Yes,
Hafiz and Qur'an. First of all, I think it is impossible to bring all that into English. And anybody tells you, the leading scholar of Islamic mysticism at Harvard, when I was here, told me that I was the stupidest person she'd ever met because nobody could translate Hafiz. I'm like, I agree. What do you want? Everybody to learn Persian? Not going to happen. If I get 20%, we're good. So I think some languages are easier than others. With Hafiz, there are extensive footnotes. I have never been fluent in Persian, but I have a scholarly understanding of classical Persian. I studied it here. I studied it in Esfahan, Iran. And I studied Urdu too, but just to get by in the street. So I can't read Khaleb or any of those amazing, poets that were in Lucknow and everywhere else in the original. So I feel like I have enough of the cultural background. I also have a very close friend who's Iranian, who studied classical Persian poetry. He's a practicing Sufi. He's a filmmaker, and he teaches Persian language. And so he checked my first work of Hafiz. We did the second edition together, and he checked my work on Farrokhzad. So that's a really labor-intensive process. So he and I would just spend hours going over a 12-line ghazal, and you do your best. And some poems simply can't make it across the divide, and some can.
Salute to you. Thank you for bringing that to light. But those are really precious gems.
Well, there are amazing languages and poetry in those languages. Americans and even in the West, we don't have that. Shakespeare doesn't even come close to the role of poetry in that language. There's an amazing film coming out that I get to be part of. It's on calligraphy. It's coming out this spring. It's a documentary on the intersection of calligraphy and Persian art and the poetry and what it means in the Persian language and how it's being done in the diaspora. So if we talk afterwards, I will give you the name of the filmmaker.
Please do. Thank you.
I have one final question. What is the greatest long poem ever written across time and across literary canon?
Ours.
Yeah. I have to
Do you have a
say,
vote?
I have a vote on the Divine Comedy within my, I know there are many, I'm sure there are many great across cultures that I'm not as familiar with, but I would have to go with the Divine Comedy.
With a long poem.
Rashida.
The what?
No,
Rashida. The great.
I'm thinking maybe. Well, I mean, I'm a fan of Beowulf, but I think maybe the Masnavi, the Rumi's Masnavi, or Attar's Conference of the Birds. I mean, I too am missing, poetry in different languages, the Ramayana. I mean, there's all kinds of amazing stuff. I think parts of the cantos are sublime. Too bad the author had his issues and it's so inconsistent.
Well, thank you both.
Do you have a nominee for that?
Not made for me. I don't know. Song of Songs, maybe.
Oh, the Bible.
yeah.
The Bible.
Yeah.
I got thrown out of confirmation.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Song of Songs.
Yeah, Song of Songs.
Well, let's give a round of applause. Thank you all for coming. Will you please put your chairs up against the wall? We have some books for sale.
That's great.
We're signing books.
Now, was that animation?
Yes.
I had a class.
Really?
She put that. The blackboard.
Close your eyes.
Close her eyes.
And talk for now.
And talk for now. That would go over big.
Great talk.
Can you sign my
I
book?
gotta get it.
It's beat up because. Let me get my pen. I was not smart enough to bring it up.
I was going to be a astrophysicist.
Oh, wow.
I'm totally still fascinated. I've been writing some poems with matter.
Yeah, go for it.
Wow.
I'm totally into quantum physics.
All this. I didn't know
Here,
about it.
tell us whatever.
Yeah, very cool.
I read Hymn of the
Tell me your name again.
Elizabeth.
But also,
I read Hymn of the Universe by Pierre. I don't know his name, but there was a vibrating of the page in this book.
already 19, almost
Very strange.
almost 2050.
It's going by too fast, but that's just the nature of the beast, I'm afraid.
Is that what you say? Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much. Yep.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I have somebody.
There was somebody.
And I have Francis. Deal up on there.
People don't recognize me.
There are as many people here as.
So glad you acted on those obsessions of yours. It was just very, very beautiful hearing you read. And since we were on the topic of Iranian poetry and Urdu, etc., I just wanted to share one couplet
Okay.
of my favorite Urdu poet. I mean, Ghalib is the one who gets the
He gets
spotlight.
all the press. It's
Yeah,
your favorite.
But Mir Taqi Mir is my absolute favorite. There is just one couplet in which he describes what crying is. And it touches my heart so deeply. So I'll read it in Urdu and then I will give you a very weak
Great.
translation. So it's Ashkitar Qatrae Khoon Lakhn Jigar Parae Dil. Ashkitar Qatrae Khoon. Most of this is actually Farsi.
Yeah, I was going to say, I recognize these words.
Qatrae Khoon Lakhn Jigar Parae Dil. Ek se ek adad aankh se behkar nikla. And what he's saying is, like literally giving you a kind of a chemical composition of tear. So ashkitar means the wet tear, right?
Yeah.
Qatrae khoon is a drop of blood.
Yeah.
Lahti jigar is a lacerated piece of the liver.
Right,
And
which is a stream of six.
exactly. And Fare-Dil means a fragment of the heart. So he says a wet tear, a drop of blood, a lacerated liver, and a fragment of my broken heart. Those are the things that fell in single file from my eyes.
And you can't do that anymore,
Right?
right? When you get to the liver part, all of your American.
Yeah, they were like, what? Yeah, because it's the seat of emotions and in our sensibility.
Yes, but not ours.
Right. Just wanted to share that.
Pleasure to meet you.
It's a pleasure.
Hi, David. Thanks for coming tonight.
Oh, yeah, it was a pleasure. Yeah, I've read the manuscript. I have a copy of it, but this is new to me, so I'm very grateful.
You know, I know we're working right now. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Very communicative.
Do that.
Don't inscribe it, just sign it.
I got it.
It'll be worth, it'll be worth it. It'll be worth more since. That was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for your question. Thank you, bro.
Yep.
I was wondering if either of you had read Patterson anytime when
I have.
when you.
I have.
William Carlos Weiss?
Yeah, but I mean, doesn't he quote directly? Doesn't he use a lot of source
Like old,
material from?
like Olson,
Yeah.
like the Maximus
Right, right.
lift stuff.
Yeah.
David,
No, don't inscribe it, just
Sign it.
Just sign it. I'm always finding books and used books to my best friend. I'm like,
I guess not.
she's your best friend. And you're still alive and she's still alive. What's this book doing? His books. I understand. People get so many books thrown at them.
I can sign my copy.
Really.
I can sign that one too.
That bass player too.